Good evening. Good evening. My name is Melina Tsiamos, and on behalf of the Austrian Cultural Forum New York, I warmly welcome you to tonight's event, which is the second event in our newly initiated series of art talks. Tonight, we will hear about Austrian-American artist Frederick Kiesler, who is recognized today as one of the most important avant-garde artists of the 20th century. He worked in the fields of theater, exhibition, and industrial design, as well as architecture, painting, and sculpture. He first appeared on the stage of the international avant-garde in the 1920s and acquainted himself with leading figures of the Dada movement, the Bauhaus, and other such movements. In 1925, he developed City in Space, a futuristic vision of a floating urban megastructure for the Austrian theater section of the World's Fair held in Paris. Its international success earned Kiesler an invitation to curate the International Theater Exposition in New York, where he would remain permanently based until his death. It is because of this multifaceted nature of Kiesler's work that it remains as current as ever, inspiring scholars and institutions from all around the world to continue to explore it. We are especially pleased to host this evening, not only because the ACFNY has a long-standing relationship with Kiesler, but also because Raymond Abraham, the acclaimed Austrian architect of this unique building, enjoyed a deep friendship with him. Our speakers tonight are Abraham Thomas, the Daniel Brodsky Curator of Modern Architecture, Design, and Decorative Arts in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. He is the curator of this year's Roof Garden Commission at the Met by Lauren Halsey, and also curated the collections exhibition Community, the Architecture of Civic Space and Private Domains, featuring the museum's recent acquisition of the model for Kiesler's Woodstock Theater project. And this is still on view until October 15th, for those who are interested. Prior to that, Thomas has worked at the Smithsonian Institution and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and other institutions. And our second speaker, Stephanie Buhmann, the ACFNY's head of visual arts, architecture, and design, and the initiator of this series. From 2010 to 2022, she served as the director of the estate of Frederick Kiesler, New York. She has published extensively on modern and contemporary art, also on Frederick Kiesler, and has curated many exhibitions. Most recently, the exhibition that is on show in our gallery right now on Roma artist Chaya Stoica. And if you have a chance, after this event, we invite you to check out this exhibition. It's still open for the guests of tonight's event. The gallery, is open for you to explore if you have the time. Now, I hope you enjoy tonight's event, and I give the floor to Abraham Thomas.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's lovely to see you all, and I'd like to also say a special thank you to Stephanie for this lovely invitation to join you all this evening. And I also want to thank Stephanie for being the main force behind our acquisition of this wonderful model by Frederick Kiesler for the Space Theatre. I think we started talking probably this time last year, or maybe a year and a half ago, and in your previous role as director of the estate of Frederick Kiesler. So thank you for those early conversations which have led to today. So I'm here, and I wanted, for the next 10 minutes or so, just to talk a little bit more about this project by Frederick Kiesler and this, as you heard earlier, this recent acquisition that we made this wonderful model for his space theatre project. And then I also will spend a couple of minutes just talking about the exhibition which this forms the centerpiece for. Those early conversations with Stephanie really started me thinking about these ideas of community and sort of the idea of experimental architecture. And so this acquisition was really important for us at the Met, where we're really expanding our collections of architecture, particularly right now as we're planning the new wing for modern and contemporary art, the Tang wing, working with the wonderful architect Frida Escobedo. Thanks to Stephanie and other colleagues, we added this wonderful model to our collection. This was a rare survival of a model by Frederick Kiesler for one of his architectural projects, a sadly unbuilt project for his space theatre for Woodstock, for the artist colony there in Woodstock. He won a competition in 1932 to design this community theatre, which was intended to be an extremely flexible, adaptable space. It was a theatre, and I'm just showing you here an image on the left of the model as it exists now, and on the right, a historical photograph, one of a few images we have of the time when this actual model and the competition was being published. It was an extremely adaptable, flexible structure that was intended for that community in Woodstock, for not just theatre and opera, but also for circus events, sporting events, small community gatherings, dance performances, film projections and screenings. So for me, it really does summarize a number of Kiesler's ideas about flexibility and design and architecture. And here I'm just showing you a couple of other examples of the historical photographs, which give you a sense of how the model itself was equipped to be able to show the various modes of display and kind of installation, and these various aspects of expansion and compression, which show the various sort of functions and options that allowed this single venue to be, to cater for a large number of event types. The other thing that I find really fascinating about this project is that Kiesler was really thinking about the efficiency of the construction and assembly of this project. So the idea was that all of the building parts were going to be prefabricated components, so tubular steel, sailcloth, semi-transparent screens, so that the whole structure would be not only adaptable, but could be actually assembled in a fairly short period of time. So the idea was that it could sort of be erected from scratch in about 2 weeks for those busy summer months for the art colony in Woodstock. And one of my favorite images is actually the one on the right, which shows the model with these ball bearings sort of representing actors and other elements that represent sort of stage set elements. And I love all the creativity that Kiesler applied to this model. And further to that, I mentioned that this was a pretty rare survival for an architectural model of that period, almost 100 years old, this model now. But what's exceptionally interesting is that not only is it a survival of a paper and card model, so very fragile, but the model that Kiesler designed for that, the competition-winning entry, was itself, it consisted of a number of sort of plug-and-play components. So the model itself, as you saw from those historical photographs, had all these additional elements which you can sort of see laid out here, which allowed you to literally sort of plug in and sort of adapt the model itself, so the model could actually demonstrate its sort of versatility. And we're very lucky that the model itself has a number of these parts that still survive. So you'll see an image later on of how we've displayed it at the Met with a number of those elements in a sort of exploded form. The other really fascinating thing is that the model came with this suitcase, which you can see in the upper left, which is so interesting for me because it's I've always been interested in the objects that sort of contain other objects and how certain objects travel with artists or designers from location to location. And this suitcase, as you can see, is covered with, it's very battered and old, but it's covered in a number of transport ship labels. And many of these labels actually indicate that this was the same suitcase that Kiesler took with him on his initial transatlantic voyage when he left Europe and came to the States, as you heard in the introduction earlier on. And this was also the same suitcase that meant so much to him because it was what he brought with him from Europe, but also was the very same suitcase that contained this model for all those decades throughout Kiesler's life, because as I mentioned before, it wasn't built. It was a project that never saw the light of day because of the onset of the Great Depression. But I think the sheer fact that Kiesler chose this one very special suitcase to be the sort of the vessel that contained this model for all those years, and so you can't help but think that he held a sort of torch for this project throughout his lifetime. This exhibition really, this model forms the centerpiece for this exhibition, which we opened at the end of last month, Community, the Architecture of Civic Space and Private Domains. And the idea was really to think about what this model represents in terms of community and sort of experimental architecture, and it was a chance to really delve into the collections, not just from the department in which I'm based, Modern and Contemporary, but also our wonderful collection of drawings in the Drawings and Prints collection. So you'll see in the image on the right the wide range of material that we have in the exhibition, and this is actually the first collections-focused architecture exhibition, at least 20th century architecture exhibition, that we at the Met have done in about 30 or 35 years. So it was a long time overdue, and you can see the wide range of material that we have in the exhibition, ranging from drawings, paintings, photographs, furniture, as you can see in the central platform, models, in addition to the Kiesler model. And it was a real chance to provide these kind of interesting juxtapositions of paintings with photographs. So for example, here on the left you'll see one of our great Edward Hopper paintings from 1953, Office in a Small City. And on the right, almost 60 years later, this photograph by Vincent Fournier depicting Niemeyer's Brasilia project. But both provide this striking juxtaposition of the solitary figure in this sort of moment of isolation and seclusion, sort of faced with the onset by the onset of modernism, and this sense of sort of creeping anxiety and terror with the sort of advancement of the modern age. And so the exhibition really looks at this idea of community from a broad range of contexts, from the largest scale, as you see here, with these large sort of city hall projects, through to the domestic context, retail context, even religious spaces. So, the examples I'm going to show you from the exhibition, I think, also speak to many of the themes that interested Kiesler during his career, because he engaged with all of those contexts through his extremely wide-ranging career. So here, for example, on the left, we have a very large-scale drawing, which actually is not much smaller than this projection screen. It's a very large drawing, a student drawing for an unrealized utopian proposal for a city hall for an unspecified area in America, with this wonderful theatrical lighting which sort of spotlights the project in the foreground and allows the sort of the city in the background to sort of recede into the distance. And on the right, another city hall project, but this is from the early 1980s by Tadao Ando, who coincidentally is the designer of our current Costume Institute exhibition on Karl Lagerfeld. And this was also unrealized, but a project for Osaka City Hall. A number of projects in the exhibition also look at this idea of domestic design, the idea of sort of community as articulated within these sort of spaces of comfort and privacy. On the left, up until the model we acquired last year, this was the only other example of Kiesler in our collection at the Met. This is a large charcoal drawing for his famous Endless House project, which was probably the project that he's most famous for and probably stayed with him the longest throughout his career in terms of his architectural projects, and envisaged this sort of series of sort of egg-like structures on sort of platforms and supports, creating a series of sort of continuous environments and interconnected spaces with these sort of organic forms. There's a very important model of this project that's actually at the Whitney collection, for example. And you can see here with his approach to draftsmanship how the sort of dizzying sort of lines and smudges of charcoal sort of allow the architectural ideas to sort of not only precede the architectural project itself, but actually go beyond those architectural ideas. And on the right, a very different context, but also for a domestic project, that, a kind of idea of the utopian home. This by James Wines for a project that he did in the 1970s called The High Rise of Homes. And the idea was to build this large-scale sort of cube frame structure, which would be the size of a sort of city block almost, but within this three-dimensional grid would be individual plots that you could buy, inside which you could choose from a sort of inventory of domestic design and sort of archetypes of home design. So kind of combining this idea of community architecture and mass-scale living with this idea of privacy and personal identity. And it's also worth noting that just as James Wines turned from sculpture to architecture in the late 60s is when he had befriended Kiesler, and Kiesler acted as a mentor and persuaded Wines to really take on architecture and move away from sculpture. So it's rather nice that we have these two drawings very close together in the exhibition. Another example of sort of experimental home design we have in the exhibition is this model by Peter Eisenman for one of his experimental house projects from the 1970s. This for his House 10 project. And you can see here how the model itself almost looks like a drawing because it's a very skewed angle in terms of the model's physicality, and the drawing almost sort of renders itself as you sort of look over the model. But when I looked at this model for the first time, it reminded me so much of Kiesler's City and Space project, which you also heard in the introduction. This idea of floating planes, this sort of idea of an urban megastructure sort of floating in space. And both projects really convey this idea of flexibility and a sense of movement within these architectural projects. And as you heard in the introduction, the City and Space project was part of the Austrian Theatre Pavilion at the 1925 Exposition in Paris, and really was what sort of precipitated Kiesler's move to New York. And then we also look at a number of projects in the exhibition which explore the idea of retail spaces as these opportunities for creating a sense of community, but also for these very radical experimental spaces. And so the object on the left is in the exhibition, which represents Olivetti's landmark New York showroom, which opened in 1953. And I'm showing just two images of that project from the time. And you'll see here how many of the Olivetti projects were displayed on these very kind of curious, sort of almost organic forms of marble that sort of extruded from the floor, the sort of very thickly veined green marble, on top of which were these typewriters and calculating machines, hanging lamps by Murano, so a very experimental space, and sort of preceded by a couple of years Carlo Scarpa's famous Olivetti showroom in Venice in the Piazza San Marco. But you'll notice that in these images is this huge plaster mural, 70 feet long, which occupied the entire wall of this space, of this retail space for Olivetti. And this was designed by the Sardinian-born American sculptor Costatino Nivola. And on the left, the object in the exhibition is actually one of the final maquettes that he produced. This is probably about 8 feet long in real life. Sandcast plaster, a technique which he developed actually in collaboration with Le Corbusier, who was a great friend of Nivola's. And so this was a chance to sort of think about the idea of retail spaces as these opportunities for creating these moments of sort of architectural magic and experimentation. Similarly, another project we have in the exhibition is this large-scale design drawing for the facade of the Bonwit Teller department store in New York, which is now the site of Trump Tower, so a very short walk from where we are today. And this was also sort of famous as a site for a lot of experimental artist interventions in those retail windows. So Bonwit Teller during the 50s and 60s had windows designed by Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, and slightly later Andy Warhol. Interestingly, Robert Rauschenberg famously was at Kiesler's funeral and almost enacted this performance where he rolled a tire through the nave of the church, I think it was. Stephanie will know the full story. And then proceeded to paint the tire and then rested it against Kiesler's casket. But yeah, Rauschenberg and Johns, they did a number of these retail windows. And of course, as many of you will know, Kiesler also designed a number of experimental retail windows for Saks Fifth Avenue. And I'm just showing you two images on the right. And then this, which is my final image, just to give you a sense of some of the other contexts in which Kiesler worked in a sort of commercial context. On the left, this is his Space House project, which was designed for the showroom of the modern age furniture company. This is from the early 30s, so a very similar period to when he's designing the Space Theatre for Woodstock. And it's extraordinary that this is the 1930s, because this looks like it could be something out of Kubrick's 2001 or sort of Joe Colombo's 60s, 70s furniture design. And the idea here, and this project, by the way, was a precursor of that Endless House project, which I showed earlier on, this idea of a very experimental domestic space. It was presented here as a sort of showcase for Kiesler's ideas. And the idea was that you have a split-level dwelling, and the upper level would be completely flexible, and you could divide up the spaces and allow them to expand and contract. Kiesler didn't describe them as rooms, he described them as sort of segments and compartments, because he didn't want the fixed idea of a room. And you'll notice on the upper right of that image, those curtains are actually made of rubber, so he was thinking about these very experimental materials in the same way that he used sailcloth in his proposal for the Woodstock Theatre. And on the right, an image from a project which I think Stephanie will also be talking about later on, Kiesler's project for Peggy Guggenheim for her Art of This Century gallery, which also was extremely experimental. Not a retail space, of course, but a commercial gallery, but had these curved surfaces. You can just about make out the sort of hanging sort of cloth that divided the space. These really interesting sort of hanging displays for the paintings, and of course Kiesler's famous sort of biomorphic furniture, the sort of fixed seating and the rockers here, which were all part of a sort of integrated environment. And so I hope those examples of Kiesler's work and some of the examples of the exhibition, which touch upon this idea of theatre and domestic space, retail space. I didn't include some examples, but there are also examples in the exhibition of sort of religious spaces as well. These are all ideas and themes that sort of really preoccupied Kiesler as well, and sort of really sum up for me the way he distilled all those ideas in his famous Woodstock Theatre project. So as you heard earlier, the exhibition is on until mid-October, so I hope you'll be intrigued enough to come and see the exhibition at the Met. But I'll now hand over to Stephanie, who's going to tell us more about Kiesler's Galaxies, I think. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Abraham. That's amazing, this background information. I hope everybody gets a chance to see that exhibition at the Met, because it's really incredible, and for me, such a thrill to see that model at the Met, and the way you displayed it and contextualized it. It's really very special. So please go until October. You have time. And it's a great pleasure to speak about Kiesler in this context here tonight for me, because it was Kiesler who brought me here. First in 2014, there was a Kiesler Prize ceremony, then there was an exhibition in 2015, and just a couple of weeks before the pandemic in 2019, I was on a panel here discussing a new book that I was able to be a part of that was highlighting Kiesler's avant-garde relationships. So Kiesler has been with me during my whole time at the Cultural Forum, and so it's very fitting that we get to have this evening. And to kind of give a balance to the architectural side of Kiesler, I would like to speak about his Galaxies tonight. It's the painted works in his oeuvre that he called Galaxies himself. And it's a subject that has not been researched this much until recently. I published my research in a book called Frederick Kiesler, Galaxies, this year with the Green Box Berlin publishing house. And also there will be an exhibition next year at Kunsthaus Zug that is highlighting Kiesler's artworks, his sculptures, his paintings. And that exhibition in Switzerland will be curated by Dr. Matthias Haldemann of Kunsthaus Zug, Gerd Zillner, the director of the Kiesler Foundation in Vienna, and myself. So I hope you get to travel and see more of Kiesler. And without much further ado, I would like to speak about Kiesler the artist. And because Kiesler worked extensively in sculpture, painting, and installation, he was a brilliant intellect. He was a multimedia artist, a multidisciplinary artist. And even though he connected with many artists in his lifetime, he did not belong to one school or thought. During his lifetime, however, he did have exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and always showing his painted works and his sculptures. So it was not something that was overshadowed during his lifetime. He was also represented by two of the most successful art dealers of the post-war era in America, Leo Castelli and Sidney Janis, who also were showing his Galaxies. And he connected with members of the De Stijl movement, Dada, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, and pop art movement. And to just illustrate the scope of the artist friendships he had, he was friends with Theo van Doesburg in Europe, Jean Arp, Arshil Gorky, Alain de Kooning, Louis Nevelson, Lee Bonteque, Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol. He even knew Egon Schiele at a time. So that just gives you an idea of how much he was connected during his lifetime, and his social network is a subject all in itself. And the documented history of his Galaxies really starts in 1947. At that time, he was collaborating with the Surrealists quite a bit, especially with André Breton, Jean Arp, and Marcel Duchamp. And we see Kiesler's rendition of his friend Jean Arp here on the left. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. It's not on display right now, but it's repeatedly shown. And in the coming 2 years, these so-called portrait Galaxies entailed various influential individuals from Kiesler's network. So artists, also literary figures, and art dealers and collectors. And at first glance, these works seem somewhat of an anomaly within Kiesler's oeuvre. And I just put one kind of interior design that he established on the top right here. It was his design for the Film Guild Cinema, to give you an idea of what he was known for at the time when he started to work on these Galaxies. He had arrived in the United States in 1926 already, via Vienna and then Berlin and Paris. And he had curated the European section of the International Theater Design Exhibition in New York, and since then had really worked as an architect and designer. So he was not known as an artist in the 40s in New York. And in fact, people had not known that he had studied at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna between 1909 and 1913. He arrived just a few months after Egon Schiele had left. And he had attended the master class of the internationally acclaimed engraver Ferdinand Schmutzer. And, sorry, I skipped a slide here. Ferdinand Schmutzer also had worked quite a bit on portraits of Viennese intellectuals, and I included the slide here of his portrait of Sigmund Freud. So when Kiesler went back in 1947 to work on his portrait Galaxies, he kind of connects with his own education. He goes back to realism, kind of the academic training he had received in Vienna, and also in terms of subject matter, he goes back to something that one of his mentors and professors during his time at the Academy had done. He's going back to portraiture. Yet, it is these beginnings, even though he wasn't known for it, that help us to illuminate why in 1947, after a hiatus of 20 years, really, where he didn't do any artwork, he went back to this subject matter. However, as a proponent of avant-garde art, who kept close rapport with artists on each side of the Atlantic, such as Jean Arp and Theo van Doesburg until he passed away, and who associated with such influential American supporters of avant-garde art as Catherine Sophie Dreyer and Julian Levy and Peggy Guggenheim, Kiesler could hardly adhere to an academic approach for very long. Rather, his artworks had to reflect the same radical vision that he had already successfully applied to his designs for Peking Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery in 1942. And we see a slide on the left, and I'm very glad I have a different slide than you, Abraham. What's nice, and I hope you can make it out, the figure here on the left side reclining on one of these chairs is actually Kiesler himself, so it's a self-portrait. Also, he had designed the Surrealist landmark exhibition, Blood Flames 1947, at the Hugo Gallery in New York, and there's a slide here on the right. And also the Hall of Superstitions, a section of the International Surrealist exhibition at Galerie Met in Paris in 1947. In all of these projects, Kiesler had cast aside the traditional modes of display, presenting paintings unframed, sculptures without pedestals. You see paintings leaning on the walls are painted in patterns. Unfortunately, we only have black and white images of that time, but they were colorful painted. Sometimes wall texts were applied to the walls as well. And these well-documented projects illustrated what Kiesler had coined correlation, the need for ending the separation of painting and sculpture from architecture. And it was a philosophy, so that is my opinion, that was closely linked to the transformation of Western society in the 20th century. Because born and raised in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Kiesler had lived through World War I in Europe and followed the developments of World War II in the United States, and he had witnessed the violent transitions of the feudal, totalitarian, and democratic social structures. And it was because of these upheavals that Kiesler, like many others of his generation, had come to believe in the creative power of a new, more enlightened society. To him, artists and poets were to play a key role in this educational process. The works were to envision the future, and the artists were supposed to guide them toward it. And Kiesler's own creations were meant as a catalyst in this regard. It was his intention to help people to see and live with art differently, to make art less precious, more interactive, to make art an integral part in everyday life. And he really wanted it to be accessible to every member in society, no matter what the background. And as early as 1948, Kiesler had declared that, quote, "Art belongs to the street, the buildings, the people," end of quote. Kind of a nice connection to what Abraham was telling us about. And then within a year of creating his first portrait Galaxies, Kiesler abruptly abandoned his traditional approach to subjects. And his first Galaxy of Marcel Duchamp, which is illustrated here in the center, was rendered from life, but it breaks up the figure into 8 separate and equally sized drawings. Organized vertically, the composition faintly evokes René Magritte's The Eternally Obvious, which I put here on the far left, kind of small. It's in the Menil collection today, but it was the work he was very familiar with. And then in 1950, he added a wooden frame that could be interpreted as a nod to Duchamp's work, Fresh Widow, from 1920, also here on the left in blue, a work with which Kiesler had been well familiar. In fact, side note, Duchamp had been a tenant of Steffi and Frederick Kiesler at some point in the 40s. So they were very close friends. There's many collaborations between them. And Kiesler would also complete one more elaborate portrait of Marcel Duchamp, which is here on the right side. It's a work on paper made of separate sheets of paper that are layered, and it's in the Philadelphia Museum collection today. And it's also work that made reference to different works by Duchamp, especially Network of Stoppages, which was the work that Kiesler owned for several years. So until the end of the 1940s, Kiesler would experiment with different materials, ranging from graphite, ink, metallic paint, and gouache on paper, such as here on the left in the work called Portrait of E.E. Cummings. It's a work in the collection of MoMA, to oil on wood, as is the case in the work in the center, a portrait of Yves Tanguy, another close friend. And this work is from 1949. It's in the estate of Frederick Kiesler today. In addition, he would begin to work with shape panels, which occasionally intersected. At this point, he had turned away from surrealism and begun to frequent the club, the regular downtown meeting place founded by 18 local artists, including Willem de Kooning. And Kiesler would grow increasingly close to de Kooning during that time, who also explored the fusion of figuration abstraction during these years. And I included one of his early women here on the right side, that's at the Hirschhorn. And through the club's weekly events, and Kiesler often was also a participant in these, such as discussions, colloquia, concerts, Kiesler became fully immersed in the ideas expressed by a new generation of artists, many of whom would soon be linked to abstract expressionism. And it was against this new backdrop, in fact, that Kiesler created a group of multi-part galaxies whose visual content was largely inspired by his own sculptural installations. In 1952, he was included in the exhibition 15 Americans at the Museum of Modern Art. It was curated by Dorothy C. Miller. And rather than a group show, it was conceived as 15 solo shows. And Kiesler contributed 2 works, an environmental sculpture that is pictured here on the left, simply called Galaxy, that he had conceived as a stage prop for production at Juilliard, and later turned into a sculpture. He also sold it to Nelson Rockefeller, and it's in MoMA's collection there today. And in addition, he contributed a multi-paneled work simply entitled Galaxy as well, the one here in the center, which has no less than 19 single units, each of which had been painted loosely in Chinese ink on paper and then mounted on fiberboard. And as a whole, this work in the center references the sculpture's distinct forms, which Alfred Barr, who wrote an article about it, called poetically, quote, architecture for sky gazers, end quote. And while monumental in the context of the exhibition, which also included Jackson Pollock's No. 5, it was not its size, but its complex fragmentation that made it so groundbreaking. And set against the vast white ground of paper, Kiesler's brushstrokes seem to emerge from seemingly nowhere. It shows his interest in Japanese calligraphy at the time, and he wasn't alone. A lot of the New York artists were introduced to Japanese avant-garde calligraphy at the time through the monthly journal Bokubi, and I included one of the issues here on the right from '51 because it has a Franz Klein on its cover. And going forward, Kiesler's Galaxies would increasingly read as clusters of works that could be viewed both independently and as part of a larger entity. And he began to write extensively on them at this point. And he stressed that his work was a direct response to the, quote, debacle of art of our time, end of quote, which had been caused by its separation from daily life. He explained that although his galaxies consisted of units that were separated from each other through intervals of varying but precisely defined dimensions, they belonged together through an inner cohesion he now likened to wireless electricity. And in 1954, and by then he was almost in his mid-60s, that's something to keep in mind, he had his first solo show at Sidney Janis Gallery. And the topic were galaxies, and he showed, for example, Galaxy C here on the left, on the top left. And in an accompanying statement, he began comparing his galaxies to groups of people, even families. He stated that the structural continuity of the galaxy reflected the expanse and the limitations of group living. This seems to suggest that Kiesler viewed the galaxies as a metaphor for modern existence, in which different members of society were irrevocably bound together. They physically reflect Kiesler's utopian concept of what society should be like, namely a community in which nobody would live in isolation and everybody could depend on each other while preserving their own distinct sense of individuality. And now I have this image in mind of the photograph you showed of the lonely figure in space. And in addition, Kiesler began to distinguish between the microcosm of each panel and the macrocosm of the galaxy at large. To him, single segments were quote-unquote details that could draw the viewer's attention by means of color. In fact, Kiesler viewed the role of the audience as being an active one. It was up to the viewer to either, quote, connect all units into one field of vision, unquote, or to remain focused on smaller units. And the large horse galaxy, which is here on the right, marks Kiesler's most ambitious work of the 50s. 5 large panels are directly mounted onto the wall, while a 6th panel is attached to the ceiling, and a 7th serves as a painted tabletop, and there's also a sculptural element as well. And overall, the composition features 3 perspectives of a strongly abstracted dead horse gored by a bullfight. And by scattering its different components around the room, the large horse galaxy manifests as a true environment, reminiscent of Picasso's mural War and Peace inside a small chapel in Vallauris in southern France. And I included the image here on the left because Picasso was indeed working on this project while Kiesler visited him in Vallauris and spent time with him and went repeatedly to his studio. And then the Galaxy's sculptural quality and segmentation became even more pronounced in 1960 and 61. And in an interview later that summer, Kiesler discussed his views on the space age in detail, explaining that it had, quote, planted a terrific fear in people's hearts, shaking up traditional beliefs in religion, science, and technology, end of quote. To Kiesler, evolution was looming, and his galaxies were ready for his audience of the future. In his solo exhibition at Leo Castelli Gallery in January 61, he presented 3 galaxies that appeared increasingly dimensional, both in regard to their overall constellation and the physicality of the panels. And we see Galaxy A here on the left. In the center, there's 2 details to show the mounting and also the true dimensionality that you don't get when you look at it heads on. And then there is Galaxy F on the right side, which is at MUMAC in Vienna. The compositions, however, became even more fluid, largely due to a new set of materials. Instead of continuing to paint directly on wood, Kiesler had returned to using paper and now favored soft pastels and charcoal crayons. As a result, his touch seemed lighter, his gestures quicker, and the palette more luminous. This provided these abstractions with a newfound sense of liberated movement. Kiesler had completed them after taking a prolonged trip to Italy, exploring its renowned art and architecture. It was the first time that he really explored that country. In fact, his memoirs and sketchbooks convey that he had particularly revered Michelangelo's fusion of figuration and abstraction, as well as Giotto's mastery of, as he said, quote, silence, end of quote. And beginning in 1960, Kiesler would treat the negative space, the white of the paper, as a strong compositional device which would bestow a sense of overall weightlessness to these works. However, it was their wooden support, again, that made them really quite groundbreaking. There's sandwiched layers of paper that are kind of mounted on cloth, sandwiched between glass and then this kind of shaped wooden support. Yet, if you look at them frontally, it seems like these works are floating in space. They don't seem to be mounted on the wall. And because they were protruding from the wall, they seem to be floating towards the viewer. They're really interacting with the audience. And that's exactly what he was going for at the end of his life and why he deemed these works most successful. He was establishing a physical bond with the audience, or between artwork and its audience. And this leads me to the last slide that I think I'm just going to use as a segue to get to our conversation part finally. The audience and the artwork. On the left, we have Kiesler in his last sculpture, Bucephalus, towards the end of his life, but kind of entering the belly of this dead horse that he created, pondering a carved relief of a poem that's inside that sculpture, kind of showing how he was really longing to become one with art, to really immerse himself in his projects, and that was his dream for others as well. And then we have a more recent image of the Mona Lisa, of course, at the Louvre. And you know, the reality we all deal with, I think, wherever we go nowadays, be it in a museum or a concert, we see a lot of screens and a lot of image taking to capture that. But I told Abram earlier this was going to be my segue to say, and look where we've ended up. But now that I've thought about it a little bit more, I think Kiesler probably would have liked it. So maybe, Abraham, you come join me and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Thank you very much. This guy? Yeah. So, Abraham, you're working in a museum context. It's not as bad as the Mona Lisa, but
It can feel like that sometimes.
yeah, that's something you're dealing with, and something you probably are thinking about, how to show works and kind of either incorporate or manage that kind of relationship with the audience, where it's now becoming more and more about image taking than really looking in depth, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's certainly, I briefly mentioned during my talk that we're working with Frida Escobedo on our new tangling of modern and contemporary art, and that's been one of the key considerations in terms of thinking about these moments of compression and expansion, rather like Kiesler's space theatre in Woodstock, because I think it is important to create those moments of intensity, but also moments of repose and reflection, not just for practical reasons, but also just to sort of get a sense of, the where you've got to in the galleries, looking back at where you've come from, what might be ahead of you, perhaps 2 floors above you, or via double height space. And so that's definitely something that we've been thinking about a lot, and how we create those spaces that offer a sort of variety of experiences, not just because of object type, but the way in which we're arranging these objects. But the image, when you showed the Mona Lisa image, it made me think a lot about how this idea of the sort of communal experience is so important in museums as well. So it's something I don't think we should let go of.
I think that's why I thought in the end he might have liked it, because it's still kind of a ritual that happens impromptu. On the one hand, of course, sad that you can't take in the artwork, that you're immersed in a crowd and lots of screens. On the other hand, it is a place that is shared by everybody at the same time. And Kiesler was very much about that kind of communal living, you mentioned earlier, but also just to kind of find a space where people can come together and be at peace together and brainstorm and be creative and dream up the future. I mean, he was very optimistic about the future.
And I love that I think you mentioned the word ritual, and I think about that a lot as well, in terms of how we enter these spaces like museums, which are a place of communing and of ritual. And when I went recently to see the current Kusama exhibition at David Zwirner Gallery, and the queues are, I don't know if anyone's been to that show, the queues literally go down to the end of the street.
They were already like that 10 years ago and more,
And I think there's something about the sort of, it's almost like a badge of pride. You queue up and then you get to see the Infinity Room, and you're only in there for like a minute or something, but there's something about that experience that you've been there with other people, and
then it's so long you can't go away,
Yeah, and but there's something about that which isn't all negative, I don't think. It can be very frustrating, I know, but there's something about those moments where you're seeing something together with an audience, and you're sort of experiencing little moments before you see the object and after the object as well, and you discuss it afterwards. And it's like going to see a great film or a great play with some,
I think it becomes frustrating when it's about the hunt, right? You don't even look. It's more like, I was here, quick, snap, go. It's no enjoyment that you were there and you want to have this memory. It's like you just hunted down this exhibition. You can go to the next thing. Yeah.
It's and it is, and I was at a few concerts this week, and it's such a shame when people just look through phones at the experience, and you sort of have the experience right in front of you.
I have to say, we're all very good. We're not the Rolling Stones, but still,
But and it's, as you say, it's something that I think Kiesler would be interested in, the idea how we consume images now, in fact, because it's partly about sort of collecting and sort of sharing and sort of showing, but it's also about this idea of just sort of rapidly consuming and moving on to the next thing, which is why when we're designing these galleries, for example, at the Met for the new Tang Wing, we're thinking about what forces people to really stop and think and reflect, rather than just moving on from object to object to object.
And he was very curious about new media. I mean, he died in 1965, too early to really, start experimenting with it. But, he was kind of at the end of his life in a similar circle as Nam June Paik, for example, and what he could have done with that, or the video artist Joan Jonas, that generation, a few years later. I think he would have been very excited by that. For example, the image of the last sculpture that I showed, Bucephalus, there's an audio component. Someone is supposed to go into the belly of the beast, so to speak, lay down their head, then there's an audio that comes on, and it's a poem that he wrote that is not read by him, but a female soft voice. I mean, there's like a whole script, basically, that follows that. Or there's an installation called Asyami that is a big sculptural installation made of many, many pieces, and there's a huge gong in the center, and an audience member is supposed to play it. In fact, some contemporary musician did play it and record it. He was interested in this interaction, and I can see, if he would have lived 15 years longer, that he would have opened up to more television. He also had a concept for a whole television show. I mean, he was not opposed to any of that. And today I read something about David Hockney and how he's using some AI for Glastonbury, and talk about like a older generation artist who's still also very much excited by all the new tools at hand.
Yeah, and actually, as I was preparing these slides, I didn't end up including an image of this, but I was just thinking of the year that Kiesler died, which is 65, right? And I believe that either 64 or 65 is the same year that Cedric Price produces his designs for the Fun Palace, which ends up being the prototype for what was the Pompidou Center. So even though Pompidou ends up opening like over 10 years after Kiesler dies, but there are seeds of ideas in the Pompidou Center via Cedric Price's Fun Palace, which I think are very Kiesler-like. And for those of you who don't know, Cedric Price's Fun Palace was this unbuilt proposal for Joan Littlewood, the British theatre producer, and the idea was this completely multimedia experience of visual art, sonic experiences, dance, screen-based projections, and entirely flexible architectural structures. And the drawings, which are in the Canadian Centre for Architecture, are amazing, and you can see clearly how Renzo Piano and Richard Rodgers borrowed from those ideas for the Pompidou Center. And I often think that Kiesler would have been right there. If he'd been alive in the 60s and 70s, he would have been, designing the Pompidou and creating it according to its original vision, which of course didn't really happen in reality. But
I agree, and I think he would have loved living in our time, where kind of these separations between genres are, kind of falling down, and the limits are not existent anymore. And maybe we can talk about one exciting project you have been involved with, the Rooftop Commission by Lauren Halsey on the rooftop of the Met. An artist who kind of also blends genres now.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you've all been, but this is part of our annual Roof Garden Commission series at the top of the Met. And this year is by the artist Lauren Halsey, who actually trained in architecture, but then did her BFA and MFA in fine art at Yale. And she has produced an architectural structure. It's not just a sort of sculpture of architecture. It's a fully realized, practical, full-scale building that we built on top of the Met's building. But as the architecture curator for the Met, I found it a fantastic project to work on, because it was working with an artist who engages with architecture from outside the world of architecture. And as you say, these sort of boundaries, are becoming more and more dissolved and permeable. And I sort of love the way in which Lauren has created this architectural structure, which is partly an ancient Egyptian temple, partly a sort of futuristic spaceship, and it sort of speaks to this idea of mark making and creating a community space. And the fact this structure will be reassembled to be part of a community center in South Central LA, where she's based. I love that it sort of has this life at the Met for 6 months, where it's not just a sort of roof garden commission, but it becomes an extension of the public realm, sort of civic space. It's experienced not just by visitors on the roof, but also has been designed so that the carvings on the outside of the main cube are scaled up and visible from the park. So there's this wonderful idea of creating this communal experience.
Kind of sitting above the treetops too, which is kind of its own, talking about spaceships,
And I think if we'd commissioned an architect to do that, it may have been a slightly different take on the idea of an architectural structure, I think. So
they really needed you, I can't wait now, all the great things that you're going to do there, because I think it's about time to weave in architecture in that conversation. The same with design, and I'm so excited that ceramics are no longer craft, they're sculpture, as they should be. The same with textiles. We're seeing so much opening up, and it's to the benefit of everyone, the artists who can experiment with different materials, and the audience who can really see connections where we were kind of left in the dark.
Yeah, and I think that's also what's unique about so my role at the Met, which is different from, say, an architecture curator at MoMA or Cooper Hewitt or the V&A, where in the modern and contemporary department we are engaging with architecture. So we're really looking at how architecture engages with those broader themes of sculpture, painting, drawing, and sort of broader histories of art practice. And that's what I think makes the Met's way of collecting and exhibiting architecture quite unique and exciting, especially for the new wing. So, yeah.
So what do you think of Kiesler's artwork? Because it's probably not something that was really in your purview, because also there hasn't been much on it yet.
Yeah,
so
I think I learned about the Galaxies.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, I think the first Galaxy I'd seen in real life was with you.
You're welcome.
Last year, yeah. So I think you definitely introduced me to the Galaxies, and it's interesting. I can't help but see the architectural aspects of those Galaxies there, because you mentioned the word environment a few times, which I think is such an apt way of describing those works, because they seem to be designed to be not static. You know, in terms of the viewer's gaze, they change, they sort of change in form and proportion, and I love that he was creating these he was conceiving spaces, not just objects. Which is such an architectural way of thinking about painting, I think.
And interestingly, he was interested in motion in the end. Like he wanted segments to move or to move when people walk by. So again, there's this kind of interaction that's even perhaps unexpected and unwilling, as we now have seen that artworks that responds to motion and changes when someone walks by.
And actually, just in the last few weeks, I've been to a couple of these sort of immersive digital experiences. I went to the American Museum of Natural History's Invisible Worlds installation, which is sort of fully immersive, and then there was Destination Cosmos downtown, which is where they have the Klimt room as well. And I wonder what Klimt would have thought of these rooms. What do you think he would have thought of these sort of new technologies that create these immersive experiences? Would he have been for it?
I don't know. It's really interesting, because for me, Schiele and Klimt are very much rooted in a certain era, and I have a very hard time to think of Kiesler and knowing that there was a moment in time when Schiele and Kiesler were in the same city, even corresponded briefly, because to me he's so much more contemporary, and he's an artist who kind of was looking towards the future and is could be living now, and I could almost imagine what he was doing. I have a very hard time imagining Klimt in 2023. I absolutely love the work, but it's I'm open to all. In that sense, I'm a traditionalist. Probably is not my favorite.
Yeah, I mean the Natural History Museum one was interesting because it was interactive, and this idea of creating an interactive environment that responds to the visitor. It felt kind of quite Kiesler-like, at least that in terms of maybe not the narrative, but the idea of the technology allowing a space to change and shift according to its participants, I guess, was sort of interesting for me, and sort of made me think of
I think as long as people talk about art, think about new ways, that's all positive, right? It doesn't have to be my favorite thing, but I love that it continues to be in our conversation and to open it up to new audiences. I think that and I have little kids that I can still manage to get them excited about a static piece on paper on the wall. They don't need all the bombardment of media, but why not experiment? I mean. It's certainly quite interesting. But maybe we open it up to the audience at this point, who might have some own opinions, questions, reflections. If there's anybody, I don't want to put anyone at the spot, but I know there's a bunch of artists probably also in the audience who might have their ideas. I'll just hop right down.
I wonder if you could talk about Kiesler's anxiety towards the nuclear age, and the idea of much of his work being, his artwork being anti-aesthetic, of maybe relating Steffi to Us, You, Me, which is, I believe, considered to be the first environmental sculpture. Am I correct? But also his last sculpture, Bucephalus, which is a morbid work of art. But I wonder if you could speak to his anxiety towards the modern age, the nuclear age, the idea that it might end.
It certainly was there. He also, as I mentioned in my talk, was talking about the anxiety that the space age had brought on people. Just completely shifted their perception of everything. And for a long time, I thought that maybe the fragmentation of the galaxies was kind of an illustration of this idea of explosion, that the surfaces are exploding. But the more I read about his own statements, I think he was really optimistic. He really believed in people. He was not someone who was giving up or really afraid of the future. He believed that people were powerful enough to become enlightened, to work towards better means. And Bucephalus, yes, it's morbid in the sense that it's, on one hand, it's kind of like an endless house idea, but it was also towards the end of his life. He knew it was coming. He was getting, very frail. He had a heart attack. He was recovering, but he knew that he was not going to live another decade. And so in a way, it becomes his sarcophagus almost, but peaceful. It wasn't a negative space. It was kind of like he started to encapsulate himself with his artwork. So I don't think of him as a very anxious artist. And I don't think that the galaxies really are explosive. I think he was interested in bringing things together. He was talking much more about intervals being kind of bridges, breathing room, electricity, that everything was connected. It wasn't about things falling apart.
I'm not an expert on Kiesler like Stephanie is, but the one project that came to mind with your question was at the same time that we acquired the space theatre model, we also acquired a model for Kiesler's entry for the monument to the unknown political prisoner, which was as some of you may know, it was a huge international, probably the first major international sculpture competition after the Second World War, and was organized by the ICA in London, and was the sort of European entries were exhibited at Tate, and MoMA exhibited the American entries, and I think until recently we didn't realize that Kiesler had actually entered this competition, but it's a very poignant memorial. It's just a small clay maquette, and it's clearly a sort of very much a product of the Cold War, and as a statement about those years of aftermath after the Second World War. And I don't know if you know much, Stephanie, about what he was thinking with that project, or if he had sort of been involved with that thinking with other artists at that time. But that sort of is the closest I can think of that sort of context.
I do not, and one of the reasons why Kiesler keeps so many of us who spend years already thinking about him fascinating is because there is really still islands to discover and things to research, and ever so often I come across something like this and I get excited, and I write my first go-to is the Foundation in Vienna, which can be visited. It's a wonderful place, and the director Gerd Zillner is probably the most knowledgeable about Kiesler, and he will find maybe one photo or one letter, but we haven't tracked anything down that really tells us more about what Kiesler was thinking, other than that he submitted it, and that'll be your job, and I'm excited to see the results at some point. Yeah. Are there any more questions over here?
This is a very undeveloped question. I'm wondering about the relationship between Kiesler's personality and his work, and that if he seems to have an anxiety about separation, and that the work is always still part of him, or there's an intimacy between the person and the work that many artists move away from, and I'm wondering if you consider that to be an interesting feature of his work.
It certainly is an interesting feature. This is a book that's very dear to my heart. It's Kiesler's memoirs, even though it's not an autobiography. It's kind of a collection of different essays. But in it, there's a really wonderful, almost like a diary entry that he writes the day after he had his exhibition opening at Castelli. And he talks about how hard it is to put his artworks, kind of his children, out there now on display for judgment. And it's a very personal statement, and it shows a lot of the anxiety of being judged, because even though he was very well known and he did a lot of interesting projects, his art world recognition really started when he was in not even mid-career, kind of 60s. He starts, I said, like when he was at MoMA in 52, you know, he's already 62 years old. That's the first time he's showing a Galaxy, a sculpture as artworks, and he had a lot of very famous artist friends. So, you know, he knew the competition he was being judged with. And that is kind of my go-to text, maybe to answer. That is that he felt very, very connected, and he kind of saw his works as children, and they were an extension of himself. They were certainly nothing separate. Yeah.
I mean, maybe it also relates to the mixing of media or the mixing of genres, that because it's neither just sculpture or just painting or just drawing, the criteria by which someone would judge his work are also not clear. They're not institutionalized that much, and so that would again be a kind of cause of anxiety, I can imagine.
Mm-hmm. There's also a letter that he kind of wrote to John Arp, and in that letter he is asking Arp if he couldn't make an introduction to Maid, the famous French gallerist, and he said, but please, please don't tell anyone what I'm doing in the studio. Like everybody, all my friends have warned me of doing that. Don't explain it to them, don't show them any images. It's so complicated. Basically, you have to come to the studio, I have to give you the introduction, I have to show what I'm doing to convey it. If I just show you a photograph, it doesn't look like anything and people will just dismiss it. So it's very important for him to have kind of a true rapport with whoever it was who was looking at his work, and he was able to excite quite a few, like Thomas Messer, for example, of the Guggenheim, who went to the studio, then got to know the work, and then all of a sudden, you know, offer him kind of a show, because they know this is a brilliant man who's doing new things that are kind of hard to talk about. You know, it's not sculpture, it's not architecture. What is it? We don't know, but it needs to be seen. Yeah. The one in the back.
Hi, I'm a little nervous asking a question because I don't know his work that well, but from the question before when you were talking about constellating and you know, I think in order to constellate, things have to deconstellate. And when you showed the slide with the Magritte next to the Kiesler, and I looked at the Magritte figure, I realized that Magritte wanted us to see the figure as whole, and he was splitting it up, so that was our work as viewers to sort of put it together. But the Kiesler seemed like he wanted it to be about the separation and the magnetism between the pieces, but not that there was an easy story to fit it back together, and that maybe that was some kind of a metaphor for these times, those times. And I'm just wondering what you think of that.
I think this is so beautifully said, and I'm just glad we're recording this question. I think it's such a wonderful observation, and it's kind of what I said earlier, that I think for him it's really about coming together. It's not about letting something fall apart or chopping it down and just fragmenting it. It's kind of just like expansion, but everything is still, like all the molecules are still in sync.
Yeah, and I also love the way you phrased that question, because there is a sense of dynamic movement with the Kiesler versus the other two examples, I think, and it feels very, in my mind, of course, being an architecture curator, I'm thinking about how he thinks about space when he's designing these projects, because when one thinks of the Endless House project or even his Space Theatre project, there's this sense of constant motion, but it's a sense of motion that's not chaotic and unordered. It's sort of controlled in some way, and the idea that there's a sort of structure and a mechanism behind it, which I think is so powerful within his work. So it allows that sort of freedom and flexibility, but there's a sort of functional purpose, whether it's a building or a domestic dwelling, and that sort of tension between sort of disorder and sort of something coalescing into something ordered is really interesting with his work, I think.
Kind of goes with the photograph you showed of the theater with all the little pebbles. Yeah. As the what is a people, converging. So at this point, I would love to invite you all to come down with us a couple of floors to a little reception, and we can continue one-on-one questions or comments. But thank you so much for being here tonight.